It's lovely, eh, when you're walking down a kind of rough area and somebody pulls up beside you and they jump out of the car to tell you how much better their life is. That's a pretty good morning. And so, but then that isn't all that happened. He ran back to his car. He said, wait a minute. He went back to his car and he got out his dad, and they came over together, and his dad was just smiling away, like a real smile, you know. And so was the kid, and they had their arms around each other, and they said, look, like, we've really been working on our relationship for the last year and a half, and it's going just great. We want to thank you. And the father said something like, I'm really happy that you got my son back to me. It's like, yes, that's what this bloody tour has been like. It's great. And everybody that's coming to these talks, that's what they're trying to do. You know, I got 3,000 people in each audience, and what they're trying to do is figure out, how can I take maximal responsibility for my own life? How can I imbue it with the meaning that helps me withstand tragedy and suffering? How can I be a better person? And wouldn't it be great if that was of optimal benefit to my family and the community?
You're getting very emotional about this.
Well, it's something, Joe. Jesus, I've seen like 150,000 people in the last 2 months. You know, and this is what it's, well, you'll have a chance to talk to Ruben about this too. This is what it's been like. It's so positive. I can't believe it. And it's just one person after another saying, like, look, I was having a rough time. The great idea of the West.
If for all the people that are watching this right now, that understand this, that hear you, that understand the passion, that want to live that way too, how can they get involved in this process? Is it simply just doing?
No, I can tell you.
Yeah.
I can tell you. All right. So most of your viewers will have watched Pinocchio.
Probably.
There's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto wishes on a star, right? And what it means is he lifts up his eyes beyond the horizon to something transcendent, to something ultimate, because that's what a star is. It's part of the eternity of the night sky. And so he lifts his eyes up above his daily concerns, and he says, what I want what I want more than anything else is that my creation will become a genuine individual, right? It's a heroic gesture because it's so unlikely. And that catalyzes the puppet's transformation into a real being. And we start as puppets. And so the trick is to get rid of your goddamn strings. And you remember in Pinocchio, he faces a lot of temptations. One is to be a liar. The other is to be a neurotic victim. That's how he ends up in Pleasure Island, where he just about gets sold into the salt mines, turns into a brain jackass and sold to the salt mines because it's run by authoritarians. Well, okay, so what you do is you lift up your eyes and you say, look, I would like being to progress in the best possible manner. And that's best for me, best for my family, best for society, maybe best for the world. Simultaneously, I would like to attain that. Whatever that is, that's what I want. You commit to that. Then you tell the truth. And then you can tell if you're telling the truth. You can tell it physiologically. And so this is something to learn. You watch what you say, and you will find out that some things you say make you come apart. They make you fall apart. And you can feel it. It's physiologically. It's centered in your solar plexus. It's a feeling of chaotic weakness and dissolution. It's a sense of self-betrayal. And then if you tell the truth, that pulls you together and strengthens you. And so you can learn to feel when your words are accurately articulating yourself. And then you practice that. And that makes you into the sort of person that won't be an Auschwitz guard, that won't play ideological games, that won't sacrifice other people to their expediency. And that's what you have to do. And that's really the core idea in Western civilization, is to build yourself into a forthright individual who's capable of telling the truth and capable of bearing the responsibilities of citizenry. And that's what people have to do.
The fact that suicide is the biggest killer of young men under the age of 45 in this country. It goes on in that interview to say, at this point, to my astonishment, Peterson begins to weep.
Yeah, well, it says, see, now it did it to me again. Look, last night, you know, I was at this talk I gave, and about 1,000 people came, and about 500 of them stayed afterwards, and most of them were young men, you know, and just one of them after the other comes up to me, and they shake my hand, and they say, look, I've been listening to what you've been saying for 6 months, and it's changed my life. It's like I was depressed, I was addicted to drugs, my relationships weren't working out, I was hopeless, I didn't have any goal. I started cleaning up my room and telling the truth and working hard on myself, and it's really working. And I just want to thank you for helping me. And I think, God, it's so sad that so many of these men, you know, they've not had an encouraging bloody word, a real encouraging word in their entire life. It just takes a little bit of encouragement and care so that they're willing to set themselves straight to some degree and start trying. It's just a catastrophe that's so rare in their lives. And so, yeah, well, every time, you see, because I see the same thing when I'm talking, my audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35, not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world. And the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary. And it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad.
Why has it happened?
Oh, God, that's a complicated question. I mean, well, it's partly happened because every culture has a tyrannical element, you know. I mean, our culture isn't perfect. There is oppressive elements to it. It's not completely fair. So some of it is just the age-old observation that you don't get a culture without a bit of a tyranny. A lot of it is resentment and failure to take responsibility. You know, it's people saying, instead of looking at the part they play in making the world a dark and terrible place, they blame something like the patriarchy and then assume that all the men who compose it are somehow malevolent tyrants or tyrants in waiting. It's like, it's ideological possession. There's just no excuse for it. It's motivated by resentment.
Does
mostly.
feminism have a role to play in that?
Well, it depends on how you define feminism. If it's the feminism that says, wouldn't it be lovely if women could offer what they have to the world so that the world would be a better place on the same footings as men? Well, no, that's great. If it's the feminism that says that Western culture is an evil, corrupt patriarchy, then absolutely. There's no excuse for that sort of thing, and it completely dominates the universities, especially in the humanities. Like, we really believe, most left-wing academics believe, that the Western culture is a corrupt patriarchal tyranny. I mean, God, wake up. Most governments in the world are run by thugs, absolute thugs. They'll kick in your door and kill you in your sleep. In the West, we have, well, a wonderful civilization. People are as free as they've ever been. You can live well here as an individual, and to consider that, you know, a corrupt patriarchal tyranny, and to lay that at the feet of young men, and then to tell them that they have to be discriminated against because of the systemic, let's say, racism and misogyny of the past. It's appalling. And men are bailing out of universities at a rate. This is not my opinion. I've been tracking these statistics for 15 years. Men are bailing out of universities at a rate you just would not believe. There won't be a man left in the humanities in 15 years at this rate. All you have to do is look at the trends. It's quite obvious, and it's no wonder. So, and it's just appalling. And I've also been described as misogynist because, you know, I've been trying to strengthen young men. It's like, of all the ridiculous ideas, that strengthening young men is somehow misogynist. I mean, God, I can't even believe what you would have to think that that was a good idea. You can't imagine how good it is to be able to go to places you've never been and to have people stop you on the streets spontaneously and say, look, my life is way better than it was. It's like, it's so good. And I've got, like, I don't know, 35,000 letters from people since last August. It's more than that. I can't keep track of them. And it's exactly the same thing. Like a quarter of them say, well, you've given me the words to say what I already knew was true. And thank you for that. I can see that in the audience. It's so interesting because I can lay out a story. People go like this, and they're doing that all the time. It's like the lights are going on. And that's a really, well, there's almost nothing better than that, to watch lights go on when you're talking to people. It's like, that's just absolutely fantastic. It's so fun. Like last night, I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up, and they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and attentive when they come up to talk to me, and then they have 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them, and they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life, and I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I hadn't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see. And
that's fantastic.
One of the things that has just blown me away in the last year, because I've talked to lots of people live, but also lots of people online, but it's more obvious live, and it's obvious in this theater as well, is that I've gone around and spoken, and a large proportion of my audience has been young men, under 30, something like that. And I've spoken to them a lot about responsibility. And what's so odd about this is that of all the things that I've spoken about, because I can see the audience and I can feel how the audience is reacting, because I'm always paying attention to all of you insofar as I can manage that. So I get some sense of how what I'm saying is landing, which you have to do if you're going to speak effectively to people. And what happens is, if I talk about responsibilities, everyone is silent, just like they are now. Silent and not moving, right? Focusing, attentive. Say, pick up your responsibility. Pick up the heaviest thing you can and carry it. And the room goes quiet and everybody's eyes open. And I think, that always makes me break up. I don't know why. I was speaking to an English journalist today who was going to write an article in Spectator magazine, and I was talking about this, and at the same point in the discussion, I had the same emotional reaction. I don't really understand it. I think there's something about it that's so crucial, because we've been fed this unending diet of rights and freedoms, and there's something about that, there's something about that that's so pathologically wrong, and people are starving for the antidote, and the antidote is truth and responsibility, right? And it isn't because that's what you should do in some I know better or someone knows better for you what you should do sense. That's the secret to a meaningful life, and without a meaningful life, then all you have is suffering and nihilism and despair and all of that, and self-contempt, and that's not good. And so it's necessary for men to stand up and take responsibility, and they all know that and are starving for that message. And the message is more that that's also a good thing, to stand up and take responsibility, because you're cursed so much now from when you're young with this notion that your active engagement with the world is part of what is destroying and undermining the planet and adding to the tyranny of the social systems. It's like, how about not so much of that, hey? Because it's too soul-deadening. It's anti-human right to the core. And my sense instead is that, if you were able to reveal the best of yourself to you in the world, that you would be an overwhelming force for good, and that whatever errors might be made along the way would wash out in the works. And that's the other thing that you see in the Abrahamic stories, because Abraham is not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination. He's a real person, and he makes mistakes, but it doesn't matter. The overarching narrative is, maintain your covenant with God, and despite your inadequacies, then not only will you prevail, but your descendants will prevail. It's like, great, that's really good news, you know. So it's been really something to see that in the stories.
And so my biggest regret is that my soccer career never materialized to what I had hoped it would. Short of that, I have no regrets. Or as we say in French from the famous song, je ne regrette rien. I don't regret anything.
Right.
So there you go. So I guess.
Yeah, well, I think I have too many opportunities and positive things. Like, I mean, I have a really good family.
Right. You mean your nuclear family or
Yeah, my parents, my siblings, my extended family, my kids. Like now that cracks me up. Well, I guess they've been so supportive over the last year or two, you know, that's really been remarkable. So I'm ridiculously blessed on that dimension. And, you know, I've worked with great people, and I know a lot of people that I really respect and admire, and I've had overwhelming public support for the last year. That's just, I just don't even know what to make of it. You know, it's just, I think that's partly why. Well, I'm in a state of surreal existence, I think, because I just don't know how to process what's happened over the last 7 months.
I'll tell you this. You are a highly deserving of all the accolades that you have. And it's a pleasure and an honor to know you. And I hope that we could continue developing our friendship and also continuing these incredible conversations, because I could tell you, by far, you've been the most popular guest on my show. I think you're at least 100,000 views more than the next guy. And so it's a real pleasure for me to talk to you.
Yeah, that Pareto distribution is working for me, man.
How would you see the role of the individual in society in the future? Are you optimistic about it?
Yes, fundamentally. And the reason I'm optimistic is partly because I'm very deeply pessimistic by nature. And I've looked at a very large number of terrible things, both in my studies and in my personal life and in my private practice. And my conclusion has been that despite the vast ocean of ignorance that we all swim in, and the overwhelming proclivity for malevolence that characterizes the human psyche, that the nobility that's part and parcel of us and the potential can transcend that and defeat it. And so it's very dark, but there's something very bright at the bottom. And so I'm very optimistic about that, and that's part of the reason that that I wrote the book that I wrote, but also that I'm touring around the world, talking to people about adopting something approximating a vision that's noble and worthy, and setting their speech straight and getting their lives together and shouldering the responsibility of the world in a manner that's good for them and their family and their communities, and to think about that as an aspirational goal that provides them with the meaning to offset the tragedy of their life. And I believe that's solid, right to the core. And my impression is that it's that knowing that, hearing that, which is something that all people already know in some sense, but hearing that articulated clearly is of great utility to people. And every time someone comes up to me, and this happens very often, multiple times a day, no matter where I am, and someone comes up to me and says, excuse me, are you Dr. Peterson? And they usually say that very politely, and they're apologetic for disturbing me, even though they're not disturbing me. They say, look, I was having a rough time a couple of years ago, addicted, alcoholic, lonesome, disturbed in my personal relationships. I've been watching your lectures, listening to your books, listening to your podcasts. Things are much better. Thank you. It's like every time that happens, it's overwhelming. I'm sorry, it always breaks me up, but it's very overwhelming. You see, it's very overwhelming to have strangers come up and tell you things that they won't tell people that are close to them. You know, it indicates that they trust, that there's a trust there, that's a deep trust, because the people who are doing this, they come up and tell me that because they're very pleased about it, but also because they know that I'll be pleased about it. And I am overwhelmingly pleased about it. And so, and for me, every time I hear something like that, that's a victory. You know, I studied the structure of totalitarianism for a very long time and became a very firm believer in the idea of good and evil. And I do believe that the most appropriate way to conceptualize the nature of human experience and is as a battle between good and evil. And I think it's a very serious battle because the evil is very dark and very terrible. And every time I see someone who has reoriented themselves in an upward direction, then I regard that as part of what defeats that terrible malevolence and bitterness. And I believe that the fundamental doctrine that each individual is a center of creation, I believe that to be literally and metaphorically true. And I also believe that each of us participate in the process of transforming what could be into what is, and that we do that as a consequence of our ethical choices, and that we shape the world as a consequence of that. And so then when I hear someone come up to me and say, look, you know, I've done everything I could in the last while to put myself together, and it's much less dark around me, I think. That's one more major victory on the bitter road uphill. So,
thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
Our daughter ended her life at 24 due to depression. If someone is determined to end their life, how can one change their mind? Oh, well, first of all, I'm very sorry about that. That's a terrible thing. Look, I had this friend, sorry. There's been a lot of depression in our family, so it's a question that cuts close to the bone. Anyways, I had this friend, a friend of my parents, and her granddaughter committed suicide, you know. She was just beating herself up about that. What could have I done? What could have I done differently? This is the problem with suicide. It leaves everybody behind thinking, oh my God, what could have I done? I could have treated the person better. I could have listened. I could have been there. It's like, and she was just beating herself up about this, really feeling that she wasn't a useful person, that she'd failed as a grandmother. She's a really good person, you know. And so I went for a walk with her, and I said, and she's married, and she likes her husband, and he's a really good guy. And I said, look, you're blaming yourself for your granddaughter's suicide. It's like, are you blaming your husband? Are you sitting him down and telling him what a useless bastard he was as a grandfather because his granddaughter committed suicide and how he failed completely? She said, no, I'd never do that. So I said, well, don't do it to yourself. No. Depression is a terrible thing. And many, many, many things cause it, and we don't understand. We understand some of them, but lots of them we don't understand at all. You know, sometimes people get depressed because they're really sick. We know that depression can be an inflammatory disease. It might be associated with autoimmune dysfunction. There's lots of reasons that people get depressed, and depressed people can go places that are so dark you just cannot imagine it. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always rescue someone, you know. But drowning yourself in the aftermath of a suicide is not helpful. So there's a good room for self-forgiveness there, you know. I mean, maybe you did some things you shouldn't have done that were reprehensible and all of that, but you don't want to beat yourself up. Remember the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And you have to apply that to yourself. I think there are times when people are so depressed that there isn't anything that anyone can do. You know, and the depressed person thinks, and this is probably the worst part of it, the depressed person thinks everywhere I look, it's nothing but catastrophe. And I can't see any way out of it. I can't see any path forward whatsoever. And then they think as well, and maybe it's the combination of these two thoughts that really make people suicidal. It's like, it's hopeless. It isn't going to get any better. No matter where I turn, there's no escape. The suffering is unbearable. And I'm absolutely no use whatsoever to anyone. It would be better for everyone if I was just gone, because if I'm not so much of a burden now that it's going to destroy their life, then I'm going to be that much of a burden in the future. And so it's hard to imagine what that's like for people, but it's dreadful. And there's lots of ways you get there. And so you can listen to people. You can desperately encourage them to seek the help they need. You know, like I've seen antidepressants work miracles on very, very many people. Now, they don't work for everyone, and they're not a panacea, but, you know, they have side effects and all of that. But one of the side effects of untreated depression is that you kill yourself, and there is no recovery from that. And the probability is actually rather high. So you can go to war with them about antidepressants. If the person can't get out of their depression and they're suicidal, it's like, what do they have to lose? 1 month on antidepressants. They'll know. Well, they might have to experiment longer, because it would depend on, you know, some people respond better to some classes of antidepressants than the others. It's worth having a war with someone if they're in dire straits and they won't do everything they can to get better. ECT works, electroconvulsive therapy works for intractable depression. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, but the modern versions of ECT aren't. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. And again, it's like there's no coming back from death. So, look, it isn't clear. You can't rescue everyone. People get sick and they die. And sometimes the way they die looks like it's depression. Depression is a multifaceted phenomenon. You can be there for them. You can listen. You can watch. You can intervene. You can try to understand. You can hold them accountable. You can do all of those things. But everyone has their own destiny, you know, and you're not omnipotent. And so sometimes a catastrophe occurs, like your daughter's. And then you should try to drag the least amount of misery forward that you can once you recover from your grief. Yeah. A close reading of 20th century history indicates, as nothing else can, the horrors that accompany loss of faith in the idea of the individual. It is only the individual, after all, who suffers. The group does not suffer. Only those who compose it. Thus, the reality of the individual must be regarded as primary. If suffering is to be regarded seriously, without such regard, there can be no motivation to reduce suffering and therefore no respite. Instead, the production of individual suffering can and has and will be again rationalized and justified for its supposed benefits for the future and the group.